This is Wildsnake, originally conceived and intended for release in 1994 for the Sega Genesis courtesy of Spectrum Holobyte and Bulletproof Software, but was eventually cancelled along with the Game Gear version. And so Wildsnake only saw release onto the Super Nintendo and Game Boy around that time. However, prototypes for these Genesis and Game Gear ports had been unleashed to the masses some time ago, and I found this one on one of those multi-cart things that a buddy of mine loaned me, so that's what we're looking at here. Now, we've covered Wildsnake twice before. The Super Nintendo and Game Boy iterations both have been the subject of prior video reviews, but those would have been years ago, so here's a quick refresher. Wildsnake is a puzzle game of sorts where you have snakes falling from the sky, and you have to position them in ways in that when a similar looking snake comes along, it can touch the older snake and eliminate it from the playfield. Each of the falling snakes can be controlled with a D-pad, slithering along the path you guided until its path is blocked, at which points the snake stops moving yet remains firmly erect, thus becoming an obstacle for the next snake to come along, and basically things start to pile up until you start killing snakes, or until you top out. A well-placed kill could be in a cascade of snakes falling to the bottom, occupying whatever empty space they could, and changing the dynamics of the playfield. A typical game of Wildsnake starts you off with only a couple snake types to manage, depending on your chosen difficulty setting, of which there are 3, but every so often a new type of snake will be brought in to make life complicated. Not only that, but in grand puzzle game tradition, the game speed ramps up as you progress further, making things a bit more challenging. Fortunately, once in a while, you'll have a flashing snake drop down and kill all the snakes of the type it touches, and there's the occasional big snake that just drops down and kills whatever crosses its path, which is always fun to watch. Aside from the aforementioned difficulty setting, you can choose from one of 7 playfields and its different shapes, which changes the dynamic of the game as a result and provides the player with somewhat of a unique challenge. There's also the King Cobra, a special mode where you are presented with a variety of challenges to complete within a specified amount of time, and when you complete a challenge you get a little animation that plays out, which is a neat little thing. There's also a 2-player mode where you and the second player can compete against one another, and you can form garbage blocks to obstruct your opponent and that sort of thing. So this Wildsnake thing on the Genesis is a prototype, right? Which means there would have been more tweaks and things that would have been done before seeing final release. You know, who knows what that would have entailed had the game gone gold and would have been released. But I'll tell you what, from what I've seen of this Wildsnake prototype for the Genesis, it's not bad. It's actually quite comparable to the SNES version that did get released. So I don't know what else they could have done on here. Maybe a little polish here and there, but I don't know. First impressions, it looks fine. I mean, the concept of Wildsnake isn't that complex once you get into the thick of it, and the mechanics of the game actually works well enough that it seems almost natural. Wildsnake as a game is unique enough to be distinct, but without straying too far off the beaten path. It's enough of a twist on the falling block style of puzzle game to be different from the norm. Just not quite enough to be a completely foreign concept. I mean, it's still relatively the same idea. You match the snakes with the matching colors and stuff, and you know, it's a good concept that plays well, controls fine with a D-pad moving the snake, and has an addictive quality to it that's synonymous with any good puzzle game of this ilk. So one area that Wildsnake on Genesis differs from the Super Nintendo version is in the visuals. The SNES versions had these simplistic patterns for backdrops, while the Genesis version has some nice illustrated sceneries to serve as backdrops, and they look fine for the most part. At least they fit the theme described when you pick them on the title screen, which also looks a little more livelier than the Super Nintendo menus, which were kind of bland. The snakes look fine for the most part, and some of them are quite distinct, though a couple may tend to look a bit alike unless you're really paying attention, particularly those with stripes. The brief animated bits during the King Cobra intermissions are well done. I think not exactly cutting edge or a smooth animation, but a neat little thing regardless. Sound's the only real weakness in Wildsnake. Sound effects are almost negligible, and the background tunes, while the SNES version had this somewhat Arabic theme to its instrumentation of the music, when translated over to the Mega Drive synth, they sound like stock Mega Drive tunes that are just there and are quite forgettable. Maybe more work could have gone into that, I guess. Maybe. I don't know. Wildsnake is a unique take on the falling block puzzle that's fun to play on the Super Nintendo and Game Boy, and this Genesis prototype is pretty much on par with those versions. A bit of a shame that this never got a formal release because it would have been another fine puzzle game to add to that Mega Drive console library. As it is, Wildsnake is a fine puzzle game on the Super Nintendo and Game Boy that's easier to come across, but this Genesis prototype of Wildsnake holds up quite well, I think.